Let's go into more detail about compounds. So at the end of the video, you should be able to differentiate between atoms and molecules in compounds, classify compounds as either ionic or covalent, determine if it's ionic or covalent based on its properties, and determine if a covalent substance is either polar or nonpolar, which sounds like gibberish for now, but realize this is what we want you to be able to do. An atom is a single particle. You just have one piece all by itself. And a molecule is made up of two or more atoms chemically combined. They can be the same thing over and over, like OO, or they can be two different things, CO. So what I tended to memorize when I was younger was that atom only has 4 letters. It's a smaller word, so it's the smaller component, one particle. And molecule has twice as many letters, so it has twice as many letters in its formula or more. It could actually have 3 or 4 atoms even. And so a compound is 2 more different types of atoms chemically combined together. So going back, the O is an element atom, and the O2 is still elemental, but it's a molecule. CO is a compound that's a molecule. So these are kind of different wordings a little bit. So they're 2 different types of atoms chemically combined together in a definite whole number ratio. For example, CO has to have a C for every O. And an H2O has to have 2 H's for every O. So definite composition, you can't just squiggle in another extra H somewhere and hope it's the same substance. There are 2 types. There's ionic substances that are made up of a metal and a nonmetal. To refresh your memory, the metals are on the left side of the table and the nonmetals are on the right. So the sodium is part of the metal group and chlorine is part of the nonmetal groups. They have specific properties such as hard crystalline structure, like salts are pretty, like a salt lick is pretty big, like for those deer or something you might put out. It's a nice big chunk of salt, it's hard. It has a high melting point and boiling point because when have you ever melted salt? You might have dissolved it, but you didn't melt it. So it's somewhat soluble in water, it depends on the salt. But if you can get it to dissolve, it will conduct electricity. So only when it's dissolved into water or melted. A covalent substance is made up of 2 or more nonmetal elements. For example, CO2 is coming from the carbon and the oxygen, both nonmetals, and it comes in a ratio of C for every 2 O's. In this case, we're doing 2 nonmetals, so these are low melting and boiling points, and they also just don't attract each other well, so they're probably gases, and they will not conduct electricity. Additionally, the covalent substances are broken into 2 parts, polar covalent that dissolves in water and nonpolar covalent that don't. So on the left side, you can see that if you add a solute, a part that you want to dissolve, into a solvent, the water, if it's soluble, its particles start to separate until they're all equally separated. And that would happen because if the water is polar and the substance is polar, they would dissolve in each other. But since water is polar and oil is not polar, it's insoluble. So we like to memorize the terminology like dissolves like. At this point, you should differentiate between atoms, molecules, and compounds, classify compounds as element ionic or covalent, determine the type of compound you have based on those properties, and tell me if the compound is also polar or nonpolar.